I'm Nancy Netzer, the inaugural Robert L. and Judith T. Winston Director of the McMullen Museum and Professor of Art History at Boston College. And I welcome all of you, maybe some of you are tuning in from across the globe, to this book presentation in conjunction with our current exhibition, Landscape of Memory, 7 installations from the Barjeel Art Foundation in Sharjah, UAE. And this evening, I have the honor and the great pleasure of introducing our speaker, a distinguished colleague in our history department, Professor Dana Sajdi. Professor Sajdi received her PhD in pre-modern social and cultural history of the Arab-speaking Eastern Mediterranean from Columbia University. And she's the author of The Barber of Damascus, Nouveau literacy in the 18th century Ottoman Levant, which has been translated into both Turkish and Arabic. She's also editor of Ottoman Tulips, Ottoman Coffee, Leisure and Lifestyle in the 18th Century, and co-editor of Transforming Loss into Beauty, Essays in Arabic Literature and Culture in Memory of Madga Al-Nowaihi. She's the recipient of several fellowships, including from Princeton University, the Wissenschfatskolleg zu Berlin, the Research Center for Anatolian Civilization, the MIT-Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. And she'll speak to us this evening about her current book project, Landscaping Medieval Damascus, A City in Words, which is a history of Damascus based on a local prose tradition describing the city beginning in the 12th century. Professor Sajdi will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions, which you're welcome to write in the chat during her presentation, and we will open it up for you to ask them at the end. I ask you to keep yourself muted during the presentation. And now please join me in welcoming Professor Dana Sajdi as she shares her screen.
Thank you. I'm starting to think, because we're so few, that maybe I shouldn't share my screen immediately and block the view. So I will share it only when it's necessary. So first, I want to thank Nancy and Rebecca for the invitation and for the coordination. I should say that as a faculty member at Boston College, I'm a big fan of the McMullen Museum and its educational mission. We get the best examples of global art and culture on our relatively small campus each semester. And each semester, like with each exhibition, you find a bunch of professors and their students very busy with the exhibit. So, and they're thinking and writing. So I'm just a total fan. And while my book, so I'm always happy to come out and do something for the McMullen. While my book project, of course, on the history of Damascus is not occasioned by the current exhibit, Landscapes of Memory, it's an appropriate context. My work is congruent with the topic of the exhibit in that it is about representations of a city, and these representations are subjective and partial. They're not attempting to be objective. But the exhibit also provides a very nice juxtaposition to my project in terms of the time period and the medium of representation. What you will hear is mostly from the medieval and early modern periods. Of course, the exhibition is very modern, it's very contemporary. And the medium of representation is not maps or painted images, but the decidedly non-visual medium of words. So share. Sorry, it's not, is this showing? Yeah. So my talk is made up of 4 unequal sections. I will start with a composite image of Damascus and why I'm writing about the city a city in words. That's the first section. I will move to discussing the sources and the conceptualization of my project, which I call Of the Density of Love and Happy Valentines. I thought I should put the emoji. I will then give you one example of how I approach the topic, and I will argue that landscaping Damascus in words was really an act of defending Damascus. And finally, a concluding note on my map of Damascus. Because the first part of the talk is full of quotations of primary sources, I will not indicate by saying quote unquote. Instead, I will acknowledge the source and the time period by century on my PowerPoint. By the way, I don't see myself. I hope that, let me try this. Yeah, okay. So what I'm gonna do is that you're gonna see on the screen the source of where I'm, of what I'm saying. So imagine that you are flying across the Mediterranean until you reach the exact middle of the Eastern Mediterranean coast. You see the thick pines and cedar forests of the Lebanon mountains. Then the landscape will gradually turn arid. The undulating mountaintops' harshness is accentuated by shades of white, ochre, and yellow. You descend on the side of Mount Qasyum, but now you're riding a back mule because you're not flying anymore. It is hot and dry. The visual effect of barrenness alone makes you thirsty, though you have a flask of water. But this is a sacrificial moment. You are on a pilgrimage. You are visiting ancient sites and caves where biblical prophets themselves blessed the landscape with their trials and their travails. You arrive at a place called Al-Rabwa. You arrive at a place called Al-Rabwa, a site where purportedly God gave the son of Mary and his mother shelter on high ground, a place of rest and security. This is according to one rather creative interpreter of the Holy Book from the 11th century. You are prostrate in supplication, hoping that the blessed dirt will stick to your clothes. You look to your left. Below you is endless orange saffron desert. But you turn a corner, and lo and behold, there lies before you, at the bottom of the valley, one of the four heavens on earth. This is Damascus. It is preening in its plush lushness. Fed by the river Barada originating in the Lebanon mountains, the oasis called Al-Ghuta hugs Damascus with generous abundance. You descend the valley while the sun ignites her fire, but then shade extends itself from every direction. You sip fresh, cool water that is more salubrious and delicious than the lips of your lover. You have arrived at the Garden of Nayrab. It is the scene of the rose. It's the season of the roses. Many scholars abandon their houses and colleges and go on picnics with their books. As one scholar recites his latest history composition, a light breeze almost imperceptibly moves the branches of the rose bushes. The leaves shiver, the fragrance is in profusion. Nature distracts our scholar, but he wields it as a weapon. He turns to a companion, a fellow scholar, and challenges him into a duel of impromptu poetry. This is how scholars tested each other's mettle, outside the usual institutional processes of certification. A good scholar must be a good poet. Such challenges in social decorum and literary skills ensured that scholars remained card-carrying members of the club of the elite. The poor companion fumbles and stumbles, reciting a couplet that lacked any creative reworking of the usual rose imagery, graceless words without elegance. Later, a third companion gossiped, "By my life, this kind of base composition often passes among many undiscerning people. The cheeks of the rose are red only due to its embarrassment by such bad poetic composition." But let's leave the pretentious performances of the scholars for now. You walk down to a place called Al-Jabha. It is the season of the orange blossoms, and you reach a square piece of land that has pavilions of shade built between walnut and white poplar trees. Every seating area is surrounded by creeks from all four sides, with ponds and pools, fountains, and abundant orange and citrus trees. It has shops for meat carvers, butchers, cooks, mezze preparers, and fruit sellers. It has also canteen keepers who attend to the picnickers and who have quilts, mats, and cloaks for those who want to stay overnight and desire to sleep. You join the revelry and feasting, camp out for a night, but you want to see Damascus, the city proper, whose sight had been forbidden by its walls. You are told that you can stay at the Venetian Fondoka, where the parties include Venetian diplomats and merchants and their local Muslim friends, and involve lots of merrymaking and wine. Or perhaps you will find a caravanserai in the eastern part of the intramural city. You could drink at the Christian tavern or visit the Jewish Farhi family mansion. You will make your decision later, but of all the 7 gates through which to enter the city, you are told that Al-Rabia gate is your best option. You walk on a columned part of a straight street, whose name, Al-Shari' al-Mustaqim, is translated straight street. Names rarely deceive. This is the direct descendant of its earlier name in the Latin guise, Via Recta. This reveals another aspect of the city's past. The whole form of the old intramural city and some of its visible ruins signal a Greco-Roman plan. But rather than going straight, you veer to the left to visit the only obvious monumental building in the city, which is not tall, but its sheer mass covers a large area. This is the second earliest surviving monument in all of Islamic history, the Umayyad Mosque, the main congregational mosque of the city. Once you are in the mosque's large courtyard, you are dazzled, almost blinded by brilliant mural mosaics featuring lush and gilded landscapes, reflecting Damascus's own verdant nature and teasing you with illusions of heavenly paradise. This place has always been the defining and definitive landmark of the city, having been a sacred site in different guises: the pagan temple of Jupiter, the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, and finally in the 8th century, the mosque. The sacredness of the site lasted through the Aramaean, Assyrian, Chaldean, Persian, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic periods. Damascus is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth. According to Damascus herself, I have given birth to the centuries, one after another. Time itself has turned gray, for it could not catch up with my longevity. Damascus has existed before time, and so had to deal with the burden of history. My book project is a history of Islamic Damascus. It is a history that is based on descriptions left to us by its citizens and is necessarily born out of the city's longevity. These descriptions fall within a distinct genre, which emerged in the 12th century, a good 6 centuries after the Arabo-Islamic conquest of the Byzantine, largely Christian city, and continued. So it happened 6 centuries after it became Islamized. And this tradition continued uninterrupted till the 20th century, basically. Indeed, I can argue it's until yesterday. This tradition is made up entirely of words without any pictorial or cartographical representations. There are 25 major texts and over 100 related works, at least what I consider major and that I will use in my work. Despite the absence of pictures, I call this genre prose cityscape, taking cue from the Italian Renaissance tradition of landscape painting and its offshoot, the Dutch and then Venetian cityscape counterparts. Damascene prose cityscape is a tradition that is distinct. It came about from a continuous and uninterrupted conversation where each text is a sequel or an abridgment of a preceding text, and they all acknowledge and cite the originary and monumental representation, the canonical text of the great scholar Ibn Asakir in the 12th century. So even in the 20th century, everybody acknowledged that this is the guy who started it from the 12th century. And so he's the base. The profile of the city writers of Damascus is remarkably homogeneous. Almost all of them were scholars, all male. Most of these scholars were professors of hadith, and many of them were historians. This distinguishes the Damascene tradition from other city texts from both the Islamic and global perspectives. While Rome, Jerusalem, Constantinople, London, and the Chinese cities of Chang and Kaifeng had their abundant shares of textual description, I doubt there is any tradition as insistent, as local, as limited to the form or genre, and as defensive as that of Damascus. A big part of my talk today will not be about Damascus itself, but about explaining the intriguing density of texts and the homogeneity and hegemonic trait of their authors. So if this were an art history talk about the history of painted portrayals of, say, Amsterdam, Delft, or Venice, I would be speaking less about how the cities were represented and more about the social conditions that allowed for the artists, say, Van der Weyden, Vermeer, or Canaletto to exist. So the rest of my talk is about how and why the tradition of prose cityscapes emerged and the socioeconomic and political changes that necessitated its existence. Search for Damascus or Syria on the internet today, and you will see mostly images and maps of the war between the Syrian regime and its opposition, extending in proxy to regional and the mightiest of world powers. You will find military maps and contested territories, videos of sites of destroyed monuments and alleged chemical attacks, images of fleeing populations and crowded refugee camps, and in just this past week, images of people, dead and alive, retrieved from under the rubble of an earthquake that most cruelly hit an already devastated place. These portrayals of war and desperation, of loss of life and home, of heritage destroyed have masked the history, faces, and colors of Damascus. In the West, few people know Damascus as an imperial capital with splendorous Islamic architecture and glorious pre-Islamic past. A site of knowledge dotted with colleges echoing with book recitations, a pleasure park brimming with picnickers and the dins of their pots and pans, a divinely blessed terrain full with pilgrims armed with protective amulets and pocket guidebooks, a market of international trade where Venetian, French, and English merchants dressed up in the latest kaftan fashion. Damascus was a cosmopolitan, vibrant, and bustling urban center. It is a place to which people flocked and where they yearned to live. Far from the conception of Damascus today as an inhospitable zone, the verdant nature kept Damascene satiated, sheltered, enchanted, and very busy. Its lush beauty is unmatched from Egypt all the way to the end of China. I think I lost, yeah, this is it. I think I lost, yeah, that's it. More poignantly, in the words of Imaduddin al-Asfahani, the city's every part, and this is quote, every part was refuge for the vanquished and free residence for the poor, unquote. Damascus was not a city from which people fled, rather it welcomed the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses. In writing my book, as opposed to the limited topic in this talk, my aim is to reinstate the layers of history and retrieve for the city the many colors that have now faded into and been obscured by the many images of the tragedies of war and natural disasters. By taking the authors of these descriptions as my local guides, I and my readers will have the opportunity to walk through the different parts of the city, luxuriate in its monuments and buildings, delight in its orchards and parks, and visit its nearby villages and shrines. We will come to know the city and trace how it changed over time, while in the process explore each author's omissions, emphases, and eccentricities. So just think of paintings of Venice. I mean, the San Marco is there in every painting, but each painter has their own way and their own agenda in the way that they're presented. So this is how I plan to do Damascus. So rather, we will see different portrayals of Damascus as its own residents wanted us to remember it. Their landscapes of memory. And because of my author's insistence on the exclusive use of words, I too, in an implied contract with these authors, will resist showing images. As my intention through this book is to redeploy and continue this tradition of landscaping in words, but this time in the English language. And although I use the metaphors of the painted landscape and cityscape and borrow concept from scholarship on them to think about my text, I will continue like the authors of my text to insist on the use of words. So I use the first part of my talk to draw a composite image of the city from different time periods without reference to pictures or to maps. And I'm hoping that my prose will be vivid enough to give you images as a reader. So now I'm in the second part of the talk, which is called Of the Density of Love. I said that I would spend a part of my talk explaining the density of text about the city. Written Damascus is a labor of love, not only for the city, but the earliest texts were in dedication to a heroic ruler whose magnanimity often extended for the benefit of the scholar. Ibn Asakir, the first author to offer us a comprehensive, systematic, and fully articulated description of Damascus, wrote it while under the spell of the great Sultan Nur-ed-Din Zengi, who in the 12th century was the first to unite Syria after a few centuries of disarray, rebuilt Damascus, pushed back the Shi'i Fatimid regime in Cairo, and he also began a holy war against the Crusaders in Palestine. Similarly, the second author in the following century, Ibn Shaddad, worked in the employ of the Sultan al-Zahir Baybars. This latter was a rock star in the time period, not only because he finally rid Syria and Palestine of the Crusader states, but also because he routed the deadly Mongols after their sack of Baghdad in the middle of the 13th century. This relationship between the scholar and the Sultan is a pattern that reveals a new political and social configuration. The genre of city description, at least in the case of Damascus, is a product of this new arrangement. The period between the 10th and 12th centuries witnessed one of the most definitive transformations in Islamic history. The change reflects not only new concepts and methods of rule, but also a new relationship to the city. The period saw the demise of the system of the caliphate and the emergence of the sultanate. To explain this rather simplistically, the caliph was a descendant of the family of the Prophet Muhammad, in whose blood, so to speak, inhered political and religious authority. With the arrival of the Turkic Seljuks from Central Asia, who first ruled on behalf of the caliphate until its actual demise, a new system had to be devised. Lacking the inherent religious authority because of their non-prophetic genealogy, and in acknowledgement of this limitation, they took on the title of Sultan, literally the one who possesses power. So every time you hear Sultan, it means that the rule is by someone probably not of an Arab genealogy and not related to the Prophet. So it's really talking about temporal power. Religious authority flowed into another local figure, the alim. Literally, it means the one who knows. And these are the scholars. As experts in the religious sciences, scholars were considered the heirs of the prophet and acted as the educators, law promulgators, and moral and social guides of the urban community, and thus became the natural representatives. I don't want to compare them to priests or clergy because their roles were much more than just religious, and they were a part and parcel of society found at every level. They're not a separate group. In this new configuration, then, we see a separation between religious and political authority in the emergence of these two new figures, the Sultan on the one hand, and the professional scholar on the other. This was tantamount to a new social contract. This contract was written in the city's topography. To compensate for his deficit in religious authority, the Sultan needed to cultivate it through patronizing its representative, the scholar, for the benefit of the urban population. The Sultan did so through the endowment of public institution structures, such as schools, colleges, mosques, mystic lodges, and hospitals, in which salaried positions awaited the scholar to occupy. So scholars became indispensable for the functioning of the city. So if you want to imagine the medieval Islamic state, it's a welfare state. It took place of its population in terms of food, education, and healthcare. All of these endowments were funded by revenues mostly tied to the city's immediate hinterland, which changed the relationship between city and countryside. The city got an infrastructural overhaul, new buildings, and a generally changed appearance. Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo would not have had such graceful skylines, such distinctive looks and styles, were it not for this new social formation. And the scholars got a particularly sweet share of the pie. So of course, they had to love their city, and oftentimes, but not always, loved the ruler as well. The love was expressed in the new genre, the prose cityscape. Like realistic landscape painting of Renaissance Italy, which emerged out of a new social formation to do with the passage to capitalism and the commodification of land, the Arabic prose description expressed a new way of seeing the world. And as opposed to the stationary paintings of the Renaissance and the Dutch Golden Age, the Damascene cityscape was also about a new way of walking the city. As such, it's also reminiscent of the classical and Byzantine tradition of ekphrasis. Meandering in the city, walking it and surveying it is not only a way of animating it, but it's also a declaration of ownership. Each text is an itinerary, a city forever codified in paths charted by the scholar. By walking and writing the city, these makers and shakers are representing their involvement in it and embedding themselves in their very topography, thus perpetuating their hegemony. And I just realized that I completely missed this thing just to show you how many texts I'm looking at, but it is okay. I will stop sharing the screen until the end. I had mentioned earlier that the scholars produced written Damascus in conversation, where each reverently offered his work as a continuation or a summary update of a previous authoritative cityscape. This conversation, the babble and chatter, also included squabbles and arguments about which path to take and building to value, or even about the meaning of the same building that they all described. So in walking and talking through the city, and despite their almost uniform backgrounds, the scholars also omitted, abrogated, and revised the city over the century. Not many of these revisions, updates, or new itineraries represent objective changes in the city. Rather, they reflect subjective preferences and worldviews, which constitute negotiations based on places of origin and residence, legal right affiliation, closeness to power, scholarly interest, or just personal eccentricity. Thus, in order to read between the lines of the text and to understand the occlusions and magnifications in each, delving into the lives and biographies of some of the city authors becomes a necessary part of the story. So to understand how and why Gentile Bellini painted the Piazza San Marco in Venice the way he did, one has to understand his own past and where he fits within the larger socioeconomic landscape. So in the same way that the images of Venice are an artifice, so is the Damascus that emerges out of our cityscapes. There is just too much love for the city, and I need to figure out the layers of sugar coating. So coming to the third part, it's called In Defense of Damascus. As an example of sugarcoating, I will explore Damascus in the first cityscape, not only because it represents the original moment or the originary moment of the genre, but because you have already become familiar with it. You will remember that the 12th century text of Ibn Asakir was in celebration or appreciation of the ruler Nur-ed-Din, Nur-ed-Din's military achievements and endowments in the city of Damascus. Rather expectedly, the book begins with a description of the Umayyad Mosque. There is no place in Damascus more beautiful, more iconic, more definitive, and more awash with scandal than the Umayyad Mosque. So let me expose Damascus's dirty laundry. The Umayyads were the rulers of the first Islamic empire, and they took Damascus, not Mecca, not Medina. They took Damascus as their capital. The enthronement of the Umayyads, who are from the household of the Prophet Muhammad, came by brute force, and only after they committed one of the most remembered heinous murders in Islamic history, that of Al-Hussein, the son of Ali and the grandson of the Prophet. This is one of the events that some of you might know will lead to the Sunni-Shia divide. Thus, in the eyes of many Muslims, Umayyad rule was illegitimate and just. Several decades later, when the Umayyad Caliph Al-Walid I decided to build the mosque, he destroyed the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, which had been a shared sacred space between Christians and Muslims, and built his mosque in its stead. This latter act was in violation of a treaty struck with the Christian inhabitants at the time of the Muslim conquest of the city in 634. Because that area of Damascus was handed over peacefully to the Muslims, the conquerors did not have the right to destroy the cathedral. Thus, Al-Walid's decision was controversial, even to his Muslim subjects, let alone the Christians, to whom a violation of a treaty was a dishonorable act. To add insult to injury, the monumentality and gorgeous ornamentation of the mosque was seen by the Muslim inhabitants as unnecessarily and excessively splendorous, a fact which hurt early Muslim communities' sensibilities and negatively affected their pockets because they understood that this was from the public fisc, which meant their taxes. Thus, in more ways than one, the Umayyads were seen as rotten, and they inadvertently gave Damascus a bad smell. Their rule inspired revolts both in the east and the west, when finally the Abbasids, another family from the household of the Prophet, ejected them out of rule and out of Damascus in the year 750. The Abbasids ensconced themselves in an especially built capital, glittering Baghdad, thus relegating Damascus to marginality and suffering from infamy, neither health nor self-confidence. And it was not only till the arrival of Nur-ed-Din, it was not only till the arrival of Nur-ed-Din 5 centuries later that Damascus becomes important again, at least on the Islamic landscape. So, when Ibn Asakir, a proud Damascene and a staunch Sunni like his patron Nur-ed-Din, came to describe the Umayyad Mosque in his cityscape, he felt obliged to deal with its history and the general unfavorable image of the monument and the city. He justified the violation of the treaty between Muslim conquerors and the Christian inhabitants by stating that a later Umayyad ruler, Al-Umar II, had rewarded the Christian community generously and included several other churches under the terms of the treaty, thus protecting them from destruction. So he entered other churches in lieu of the one they destroyed. As for the excessive expenditure on the monument, Ibn Asakir relates that the monies were spent from the caliph's own private pockets and not from the public fisc. Thus, the Muslim community had never carried the burden of the expenditure. Then, to justify the monumentality, Ibn Asakir tells his reader that even the very pious Caliph Al-Umar II saw that such monumentality was necessary to match and dazzle the arch enemy next door, the Byzantine, whose Christian monumental architecture exemplified in the inglorious Hagia Sophia was perhaps the greatest in the world. So Ibn Asakir, agreeing with the purported opinion of a long-dead caliph, sees the monumentality of the mosque as a necessary weapon for the Umayyad Empire against Imperial Byzantium. To beat them, you had to use their weapons, and the Byzantines were the masters of monumental architecture. Thus, when Ibn Asakir treated the mosque, he was not only describing and memorializing a glorious monument, but he was revisiting and revising its history, and in the process, he was whitewashing it. As he created justifications for the erection of the building, its monumentality and its expensive splendor, he took the mosque out of infamy and restored it to pious antiquity and classy glamour. Thus, his description also is a prescription, a curative treatment that cleaned out the mosque of bad memories. After he's done with the most important monument of the city, Ibn Asakir offers us a comprehensive survey of Damascus from the view of a city walker. Here is how his description starts. Quote, "The first mosque from the side of the market as you enter Al-Jabiya gate is an upper-level mosque known as the Saqatiyin Mosque. It has a stone stairway and a wooden stairway had been made for it on its north side. It has a leader to prayers, a caller to prayers, and it's attached to an endowment. It's a big mosque. A mosque in Darb al-Madaniyin. It is a lower-level building. In it is an olive tree. It has a leader to prayers, a caller to prayers, a library, and is attached to an endowment. It is nice." So he goes on like this to go through and he visits 242 different mosques. I don't know how. There must be, whatever. There must be little rooms. Then he turns to a survey of the churches and synagogues, canals, rivers, and bathhouses, gates, and then the cemeteries and shrines of the city. This series of surveys allows the reader to meander around the city and see its structures, even memorializing a random olive tree in the reality of the 12th century. This is the shift in temporality, where the city is no longer described historically through inherited bookish knowledge, but is in its here and now. And the fact that the city is described as an organized, hierarchically defined space make Ibn Asakir's cityscape one of the most significant descriptions of space in the medieval period, west or east. So this is one of the most significant texts in terms, I actually consider it revolutionary for many reasons. The kind of contemporary nature of it is quite unusual. When the ruler Nuruddin overhauled Damascus, upgrading its walls and endowing it with new buildings, he renewed the city, giving it a new lease on life. What Ibn Asakir did for Damascus in words was very similar to what Nuruddin did in stone. He built up the city. He salvaged the Umayyad Mosque by revising its history, thus cleaning it up and clearing it of bad reputation so that Damascus began on a clean slate. Damascus, whose epithet famously is Al-Mahrusa, which means the well-protected city, is defended not only by its walls, but by Ibn Asakir's text, which became the canonical text that launched a tradition. Now that you know the context, you understand that defensiveness is an essential constituent of the tradition. It was born out of the understanding that Damascus is too venerable, too glamorous, too important to be relegated into a secondary position. Despite being a runner-up as the imperial capital of the Mamluk regime that's between the 13th century and the 16th century, Cairo won at the time, it remained in a secondary position with regards to Cairo. Later downgraded further with regards to the queen of all cities, Istanbul, under the Ottoman regime between the 16th and the 20th centuries. Then it became a colonial city under French imperial administration till World War II, then a capital of a quickly formed nation state drawn by the colonial hand. No matter how glittering the representation of Damascus in any of the cityscapes, the yearning for restoration of at least promotion motivates almost every single one of these texts. So my final note, I will have to share my screen now a little bit. Just a second. Whether by pure luck or due, so my final note is called my map of Damascus. Whether by pure luck or due to a logic that I do not understand, my authors reveal Damascus gradually from the center to the periphery over several centuries. The first text, as you have seen, starts with the Umayyad Mosque and focuses on the intramural city. Thereafter, later authors successively move outwards extramurally to the suburbs of Salihiyya, then the gardens on the outskirts of the city, and finally Al-Ghouta, Damascus's lush and blessed hinterland. Of course, there are overlaps, and many texts revisit the same areas to update the reader on newer features and constructions, or to offer subversive itineraries. But my point here is that the overall thrust of the text, taken together over time, is that they chronologically and in succession gradually reveal an urban system, a capital city that is the center of administration and law and the node of exchange of products and services, a dependent suburban settlement, and a productive countryside whose villages are in constant economic and cultural exchange with the city. By following that tradition chronologically through 6 chapters, I will have written the history of the city while exposing it as an urban system. While my map of Damascus will reveal an urban system, the project itself does not aspire to attain empirical validity per se, or to get confirmation from a social scientific perspective. If we are to imagine resultant Damascus visually, it will not be two-dimensionally flat as a map or a one-point perspective painted cityscape. Rather, because I follow the author's valuations, their emphases and occlusions, some places will be swollen into multi-dimensionality with overvaluation, that is, with excessive meaning, and others will be rendered vacuously flat. This multi-perspectival map of 1 or 2 and 3-dimensional spaces juxtaposed with each other at the same time reminds me of some later Ottoman pictorial representations of Istanbul, which, according to the art historian Çiğdem Kafestioğlu, intentionally have, quote unquote, multiple points of views collide, while their European counterparts remained staunchly loyal to notions of verisimilitude and a unitary view. For me, defending Damascus precisely to bring in multiple views from a unitary tradition of words. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I have to say, your eloquent evocation of the city of Damascus in every way equals that of your medieval scholarly authors. So thank you. And thank you for not sugarcoating it. I'm sure your book too will give Damascus a new lease on life. So I'd like to open this up to questions. Anyone?
Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, Robin, you wanna,
yeah. This is sort of a strange question coming from me, but your different authors that flashed across the screen that we only got a brief view of.
Sorry.
That's fine. When are the last authors? And I'm just curious if there's a kind of Ba'athist textual cityscape that was done in the sort of post-World War II period of Damascus and what it looks like.
Oh, great question. So what happens is the 18th century, we have one major author, and he's one of my, actually, he's the one who led me back to the tradition. I discovered him first. And he's really an antiquarian. What he's doing is he's collecting all these texts and going on the streets and trying to look for vestiges of buildings that he finds in the 12th century. So he's like an archaeologist, right? Who's like registering the layers of like, you know, the ruins. And then it goes into a lull. The 19th century, there's a whole bunch of them who are the post-Enlightenment guys, right? They're very, you know, they are, by now we are in a post-Enlightenment period, and there's an idea of objectivity and of how you do the city, while at the same time there's nostalgia for the older Damascus. So there's a bunch of them that kind of combine a certain mathematically informed geographical look with like the poetry that they've read in all these medieval texts, right? The most important one to my mind is an early 20th century one. The guy was an anthropologist, an archaeologist, a geographer, and he wrote an amazing survey of the hinterland. And it looks at kind of anthropological past and looks at like Aramaic subtrace of language and things like that. And that it was, you know, during the French Mandate period. I don't want to call it Ba'athist, I want to call it nationalist, right? So I can't say that there's anything that is specifically Ba'athist, but definitely the 20th century is all nationalist representations. Ginny.
Thank you for that, Dana. It was beautiful to see you evoke for us the coming together of a tradition like this that is multivocal. It was very economically done too. So I'm going to ask my typical social historian question because you intrigued me with highlighting a couple of authors, but then at one point noting that a new social formation is taking place that is, I won't, you always put this more subtly than I would think of putting it, but there's a new social formation taking place that is eliciting a literary response in some way or supporting a literary response. Do you see that there's a chronology to that? In other words, it's not just at that one moment where you see this revolutionary new text coming into being that there's a new social formation, but it happens at different moments too. Is that a kind of methodological theme that you see running through the whole book?
So, and actually it won't run through the book because I see the new social formation as like the most definitive change. After that, the Mamluks and the Ottomans have the same system, the same idea, which is sultan and endowments. And when you have these endowments, scholars are going to compete for these positions. So this was kind of the modus operandi, if you will, for until the modern state or until the colonial moment. So this is how the system functioned, right? But what you see is objections to certain things, squabbles about serious issues, right? So some texts are clearly. So one text is a sequel to another, and though, and it's about the suburb of Salihiyya, which was first inhabited by a refugee community from Crusader Palestine who had a legal right that is different from the city. So they end up building an almost a counter city, an anti-city in the mountain, right? And they had a tradition, and they had a huge scholarly tradition and a tradition of libraries and a tradition of hadith, which is a lot of oral stuff. So they carried their history first orally, and then it was codified in books. And the first description of the city erases everything that is not from their legal right. So the next author, who's from a different legal right, but he's like, he grew up amongst them, he's educated in the same colleges, he loves them, but his sequel kind of fills in the blanks, and without being rude, it's like, I don't know what you call them, these writing tablet that you can write on and just erase or show the two layers. So he kind of encodes both, right? So he fixes it, and he shows the history of his community in that text. So each one of them is an occasion for me to speak about a specific either cultural or intellectual or political moment to add. So what I'm trying to do in each chapter is find one monument to center. So one author, one monument, which would be representative of the period, let's say, right? And also one cultural, social, or something for the education of the reader. So it's not just architectural or like, you know, so it's like the reason that this particular text came seems to be this particular author's position in this particular moment in time.
Thank you.
And I also didn't mention in my talk that I'm really toying with the idea of doing my epilogue of the book with the photograph of French photographer who was one of the earliest photographers in the Middle East at all, and what he does to the buildings when he photographs them, right? And how the written tradition is so different to the colonial moment and this freezing frame that takes place. So I've looked at a lot of his images. We have a lot of them in Harvard. We have a lot of them in Princeton. But I have to learn a whole new other field, and I'm kind of a little bit reticent at this point.
We have a question in the chat from Blair Winter. She
Yes.
says,
Oh, Blair, hi.
she says, that was great. Thank you. Can't wait to read the book. I have a question on methodology. How did you decide what authors to include and what sections of the city or their writings to focus on?
So the authors, I mean, it took me years and years and years to find the tradition. I mean, there are famous ones and there are people that are completely unknown, but they're speaking within the same tradition, right? And so I literally looked at every single one of them. And with every turning point, I chose that text. Whenever I saw a turning point, that's what I chose. And and sometimes I use kind of what I call ancillary text to kind of fill in the blanks. But the other thing that is really interesting is that, as I mentioned towards the end of my talk, somehow the description of the city is growing with it, right? And so we don't get to Salahiyya till really, Salahiyya starts in the 11th century, but the first description of it does not appear till the 16th century, right? So it takes a while for the text to show up. And the 16th century one is actually preserving an oral past, right? And that's what is lovely about it. It's like, it's multiple layers, right? And that text, some of it is missing, but I'm retrieving it from an 18th century text. So basically I have layers and layers and layers to just bring one thing. So the focus of this, the focus on the city, as I told you, the texts themselves take me with them chronologically, but I'm also, for example, and it's not a coincidence that the first colleges, which start, you know, the phenomenon of colleges or madrasas starts in the 11th century, but they become a part of the topography in the 13th century. It's not a coincidence that they start intramurally, right? And that's where I start. It's like a new phenomenon, a new feature. That's how I focus. So when I go to Salahiyya, which is the suburb, I'm going to focus on the library because it was a place of libraries, and you know, then when I move to the gardens, there's a whole text about picnics. So that's going to be about picnics, right? So it's the obvious feature of the text is what I'm going to focus on.
And we have another question from
Carolyn. Hi, Carolyn.
Would you also elaborate on the tradition behind, quote, using words to describe cityscape instead of pictures or paintings/drawings?
Oh, I'm so sorry, because Carolyn is a painter, and so I think it's rubbing her the wrong way. So So I thought a lot about this because, of course, the immediate impression, how people react to you immediately when you're talking about pre-modern Middle Eastern history and you're talking about images, everybody says, oh, it is because Islamic ban on images, which is not true. There's so many images. Or it's because of the fear of images and iconic, blah, blah, blah. No, I actually compare the birth of the scholar is like the birth of the artist in the Renaissance. These are the two hegemonic figures at a specific moment in time that represent culture, right? So one will use the pen and the other is going to use the brush. And they both are under patronage. They're both under kind of, relatively new systems. I don't want to say that the passage in the 20th century is to capitalism, but in Europe, it's definitely the passage to capitalism is what brings this new system, right? So what I'm trying to say, the hegemonic figure that comes out of the social formation, what is his main instrument? It's the pen. It's not the pen, it's not the brush. And with a history of church going and looking at pictures, right? It's obvious that it's obvious that people understand how to communicate with paintings more than other things. The problem with the Muslims is they were literate from a long time before, right? So they were literate from much earlier time. So they didn't have to go to images when people could read. So that's how I elaborated, but I think there are the same impulse, the same instinct of painting the city, of representing it. And it actually shows a socioeconomic new relationship to land, to how you identify with your physical surrounding.
Dana, I have a question. When the Grand Tour expands to the Middle East in the 19th century, do we have then a group of travel diaries the way we do through Western Europe? And if so, have you compared any of these descriptions to those in your scholarly texts?
So there's plenty. There's a density of Western descriptions, especially some of them came for pilgrimage and passed through Damascus on the way, So there's plenty, and there's actually some drawings and things like that. But you cannot not notice how notice their specific viewpoint and the density of the text that they had read before coming, where they're focusing on very specific things. And this is what we call Orientalism, right?
Yeah.
Which is they're not referring to the freshness of the scene that they see around them. Their view is informed by a whole bunch of knowledge before they came. So they're looking for very specific things, right? And so it is remarkably different, right? And so one of the reasons why I'm writing this book, I want it to be a very Damascene book. I want to get everybody away and just give them their, I don't want them to be, just like try to value them for what they do and try to make this a worthwhile, so what I'm aspiring for is like, this is an exhibition on Venice, when you have you'll find it in the book. It's an exhibition on Damascus, you'll find it in the book.
It's great.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Do they talk?
Pamela, go ahead. I can't see you though.
Oh, I don't know why. Oh, my light is off here.
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Do they talk at all about water sources or fountains or springs, or one would think that yeah, go ahead. Because
they
that's
do.
the principle of the city sometimes.
Yeah. So yeah, they do very much, but they're much more obsessed with buildings, the endowments by rulers, right? They're much more obsessed with that. Mm-hmm. But in most all of them, there is a description of the river system. And of course, as you know, Damascus had an underground, pipes from the Greco-Roman period. It had running water, right? And so the fountains, especially when you go out to landscape gardens that were for picnicking, right? So there's a lot of descriptions of that, but their descriptions are not like a systematic of, let me describe to you how the fountain is working now, right? It's just like you enter a space and there's a fountain that is whatever shape on this side, and then you'll find these trees on the other side, that kind of thing. So it's not as systematic as their attention to buildings, but it will be a part of my description. I mean, when I get to the 19th century and Ghouta, it's all about water and how water comes into the city.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Thank you. Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions, I think we've made Dana work very hard. And you need to have some supper. But it remains for me to thank you for this really wonderful hour and a half. And
Thank you.
congratulate you on this forthcoming book. Can't wait to read it.
Tell me to sit down and write the rest of it, and don't invite me to talks.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Well,
you.
good luck.
Thank you so much.
Keep writing.
Thank you, Dana.
Bye. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.